For 17 years, a bomber mailed handmade explosives to universities and airlines across America. 16 bombs, 3 people dead, 23 injured, and not a single fingerprint, not a single witness, not a single lead that went anywhere. The FBI called it the longest and most expensive investigation in their history. And then one man read a document and recognized his own brother. But here is what almost nobody talks about. The manifesto that Ted Kaczynski forced newspapers to publish was not just a political document. It was a psychological blueprint, a coded map of his mind. And buried inside its 35,000 words were patterns, signatures, and linguistic fingerprints that a forensic linguist used to do something the FBI's entire investigative apparatus could not. She identified the author. This is the story of how words became the cipher, how language itself became the evidence, and how the most sophisticated domestic terrorism case in American history was finally broken not by forensic science, not by surveillance, not by informants a euro, but by the hidden patterns inside a manifesto that a bomber demanded the world read. Welcome to Shadow Cipher Files. Ted Kaczynski grew up in Chicago. He was brilliant in a way that most people never experience. At 10 years old, his IQ was tested at 167. He skipped 2 grades. At 16, he enrolled at Harvard. At 25, he became one of the youngest professors ever hired by the University of California, Berkeley, teaching mathematics at a level that his colleagues described as genuinely exceptional. And then, in 1969, he walked away from all of it. He resigned without explanation. He moved to Montana. He built a small cabin with no electricity and no running water, 12 by 10 feet, in the mountains outside Lincoln. He grew some of his own food. He read. He wrote. And he began building bombs. His first device was mailed in 1978 to a professor at Northwestern University. It was crude. It did not kill anyone. But over the following years, the devices became more sophisticated, more powerful, and more carefully designed to avoid detection. He targeted universities and airlines specifically, which is where the name came from. The FBI task force investigating him was called Unabomber Euro, University and Airline Bomber. The name they gave their unknown subject was the Unabomber. For 17 years he sent packages. He wore gloves. He used untraceable components. He sourced materials locally to avoid creating purchasing records. He deliberately included misleading evidence, false leads, planted materials designed to send investigators in the wrong direction. He was extraordinarily careful, and for 17 years it worked. By the early 1990s, the FBI had essentially nothing. The case had consumed enormous resources. Thousands of suspects had been investigated and cleared. The task force had been running for over a decade with no viable lead. And then in 1995, Ted Kaczynski did something that would ultimately destroy him. He wrote a letter to the New York Times. In it, he offered a deal. He would stop bombing permanently if major American newspapers published a document he had written in full. He called it Industrial Society and Its Future. It was 35,000 words long. It was a detailed critique of industrial civilization, technology, and modern society. The FBI and the Justice Department faced an impossible decision. Publishing felt like surrendering to a terrorist's demands. Not publishing meant potentially more bombs and more deaths. They chose to publish. On the 19th of September, 1995, the Washington Post printed the manifesto in full as an insert. Millions of people read it. And somewhere in New Jersey, a man named David Kaczynski read it too. And something in those words felt deeply, disturbingly familiar. David Kaczynski had not spoken to his brother Ted in years. Their relationship had deteriorated through the late 1970s and 1980s. But he remembered Ted. He remembered how Ted wrote. He remembered specific phrases, specific rhythms, specific ways of constructing an argument that were uniquely, unmistakably Ted. He was not certain. He was deeply reluctant. Turning in your own brother for terrorism is not a decision any person makes easily. He spent months wrestling with it. He had his wife and a friend read the manifesto without telling them why. They identified the same feeling he had a euro, that the writing felt like a specific person, not just a general type. Eventually, David hired a private linguistics expert to compare the manifesto with letters his brother had written years earlier. The expert found significant similarities, and in early 1996, David Kaczynski contacted the FBI. This is where the forensic linguistics part of this story becomes extraordinary. The FBI brought in a linguist named Dr. Don Foster, who had previously made his reputation by identifying the author of an anonymous political memoir through linguistic analysis alone. Foster and his team performed a systematic analysis of the manifesto alongside Ted Kaczynski's known writings. What they found was not one or two similarities. It was a pattern of consistent, repeated, highly specific linguistic choices that appeared throughout both sets of writing. Choices that were unusual enough to be identifying. Choices that a person makes automatically, without conscious thought, because language patterns at that level are essentially involuntary. Let me explain what this means in practical terms. Every writer has what linguists call an idiolect. This is your personal version of a language. It includes the specific words you prefer, the sentence structures you naturally gravitate toward, the punctuation habits you have developed over decades, the specific phrases that recur in your writing, because they are how your brain naturally encodes certain concepts. Most of these choices are completely unconscious. You do not decide to prefer semicolons over dashes. You do not decide to use the word moreover at the beginning of sentences. You do not decide to construct conditional clauses in a particular order. These patterns develop over years of reading and writing and become as automatic as breathing, and they are extremely difficult to change consistently. Even when a writer deliberately tries to obscure their style, the deep patterns tend to break through because changing them requires conscious attention on every single sentence, which is cognitively impossible to maintain across 35,000 words. Ted Kaczynski was brilliant, but he was not brilliant enough to maintain a disguise across 35,000 words. The patterns were there, and they matched. Here are some specific examples of what forensic linguists found when they analyzed the manifesto. The phrase "cool-headed logician" appeared in Kaczynski's private writings. The same phrase appeared in the manifesto. This is not a common phrase. Its presence in both documents was significant. The spelling willfully, with two L's instead of the American standard single L, appeared consistently in both the manifesto and Kaczynski's personal letters. This is a British spelling variant that American writers almost never use. Its consistent appearance in both documents was a strong marker. The manifesto used the construction "feelings of inferiority" in a specific way, in a specific argumentative context. The same construction, the same framing, the same contextual use appeared in letters Kaczynski had written years before. The manifesto repeatedly used the phrase "eat cake" in a specific ironic political context. This exact usage appeared in Kaczynski's correspondence. The document showed a consistent preference for the word propaganda in contexts where most writers would use messaging, or rhetoric, or narrative. This preference was consistent across both bodies of writing. Taken individually, any one of these similarities could be coincidental. Taken together, across thousands of instances, the statistical probability of coincidence became essentially zero. The manifesto was written by the same person who wrote those letters. The linguistic fingerprint was a match. But here is what makes this even more remarkable. The manifesto itself contained a coded message that Kaczynski probably did not intend to send. Not a cipher, in the traditional sense. Not a substitution system or a hidden code, but a psychological code embedded in the content and structure of the argument itself. Forensic psychologists who analyzed the manifesto identified what they described as a classic signature pattern of a specific type of violent offender. The document was not just a political treatise. It was a performance of intellectual superiority. It was a demand for acknowledgement. It was a communication that said, in ways its author may not have fully recognized, "I am smarter than all of you, and I need you to know it." This psychological coding was itself a clue. The specific way the manifesto was constructed, the way it anticipated and dismissed counter-arguments, the way it positioned its author as uniquely clear-sighted in a world of blind followers, the way it expressed contempt for academic and intellectual institutions, from someone who had been deeply embedded in those institutions, a euro. All of this was a psychological signature. FBI profilers had been building a profile of the Unabomber for years based on the crime scene evidence. Handmade bombs, precise construction, university targets. The Manifesto confirmed and extended that profile in important ways. This was someone with exceptional technical intelligence. This was someone who felt profoundly rejected by the academic world he had once belonged to. This was someone whose violence was as much about communication as destruction. Every bomb he sent was a message, and the Manifesto was the key to reading all of them. On the 3rd of April 1996, FBI agents and Montana law enforcement surrounded a small cabin outside Lincoln, Montana. Inside was a thin, bearded man living alone with stacks of notebooks, bomb-making materials, and a typewriter. Ted Kaczynski was arrested without resistance. He was 53 years old. He had been living in that cabin for 25 years. He had a Harvard degree and a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. He had been one of the most wanted men in America for 17 years. He was caught because his brother recognized how he used words. In 1998, Ted Kaczynski pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He died in prison in June 2023 at the age of 81. The Unabomber case changed forensic linguistics permanently. Before this case, linguistic analysis was used occasionally in criminal investigations, but was not considered a primary evidentiary tool. After the Unabomber case, forensic linguistics became a recognized discipline with formal methodology, academic standards, and legal acceptance as evidence in court. The principle that the Manifesto demonstrated is now called the linguistic fingerprint theory. The idea is that every person's writing contains patterns, specific enough to identify them, and that these patterns are consistent enough and unconscious enough to be genuinely identifying even when the writer is actively trying to conceal their identity. This has been applied in cases since: anonymous threatening letters, online posts from suspects who denied writing them, documents whose authorship was disputed in legal proceedings. In each case, the methodology developed partly from the Unabomber investigation was used to identify or exclude authorship. Ted Kaczynski spent 17 years building bombs precise enough to avoid forensic detection. He wore gloves. He used untraceable parts. He planted false evidence. He was meticulous about physical evidence in a way that genuinely defeated the FBI for nearly 2 decades. But he could not defeat his own language. He could not stop writing the way he wrote. He could not silence the patterns that 17 years of solitary intellectual life had burned into his prose. He demanded the world read his words, and his words gave him away. The deepest lesson of this case is not about terrorism. It is not about intelligence or isolation, or the failures of academic institutions to support brilliant but troubled minds. It is about something more fundamental. The way you communicate is a cipher. Whether you are writing a letter, or sending an email, or posting online, or typing a manifesto that you have forced the world's newspapers to print, the patterns in your language are as unique as your fingerprints. They encode who you are. They encode how you think. They encode the history of everything you have ever read, and written, and said. And unlike fingerprints, you leave them everywhere. On everything. Every time you write. Ted Kaczynski understood codes. He understood technology. He understood forensic science, well enough to evade it, for 17 years. He just did not understand that he himself was a code, and that his own manifesto was the key. If this video has made you think differently about how language works as evidence, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment with this question answered. Do you think Ted Kaczynski knew, on some level, that publishing the manifesto would eventually lead to his capture? Or did he genuinely believe he was untraceable? I read every comment, and the answer to that question matters more than you might think for understanding what the manifesto actually was. Subscribe to Shadow Cipher Files if you want to keep going deeper, because next week we are going into a case where the ransom note itself became more controversial than the crime. A case where handwriting experts spent 30 years disagreeing about 2.5 pages of text. A case where the note either points directly at the killer or was written specifically to destroy an innocent family, and where you stand on that note tells you something about how you think about evidence. That case is coming next week. I will see you there.